Tamastu ma vidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Peace Peace Peace. Om Bolo Satguru Shivananda Maharaj Ki Jai. Swami Vishnu Devananda Maharaj Ki Jai. Om Namah Shivaya. So we continue the topic of the purification of the mind through the yamas and the niyamas. So we spoke about the yamas. We said that yama, which means restraint, is the practice of the yamas is in order to counteract the operation of the kleshas in the mind. The kleshas are the roots of suffering, which is avidya or ignorance, and the modifications of avidya, which is egoism, raga, dvesha, or attachments and desires, and then fear of death due to identification with the body. These are called kleshas, and they operate in the mind. And basically what the yogis explain is that the vision that the kleshas generate is called samsara. This is suffering. It's because we have what we call klishta vrittis. Our perceptions are contaminated with kleshas, with wrong knowledge, that we perceive the world as samsara, as painful. And the yamas come to, first of all, restrain the impulses that those kleshas create. This is the idea. Something like this, it's like there is this famous experiment that they show a chimpanzee looking at the mirror. And initially the chimpanzee is very aggressive, seeing the other monkey in the mirror. The chimpanzee is, screaming and jumping. And then gradually the chimpanzee makes the correlation and begins to see that this is me. So initially we need to restrain the impulses that come from wrong knowledge. That's the idea. For this we have yamas. So the yamas we said are ahimsa, non-violence, and cultivation of pure love. Then satya means truthfulness, that our mind is grounded in correct knowledge. So truthfulness means the yogis have a practice which is called, or a teaching which is called pramana, right knowledge. How do we know that our knowledge is right? So we need to know how to know the truth. It's called pramana. Once we learn how to know the truth, then we need to think the truth, speak the truth, and act the truth, which means according to what is evaluated as real. That's the meaning. So it's not because it feels real, or it seems real, or it sounds real. Yogis have very clear ways of how to know it's real. Asteya means not to steal and not to hoard. And brahmacharya means the practice of, we can say, self-discipline. In a general sense, specifically it means chastity or continence, which means the sublimation of the sexual energy into spiritual force. And it also means the real purpose of brahmacharya is explained in the actual word brahmacharya. Why is brahmacharya practiced? Because brahmacharya means Brahman achara, the conduct that leads to Brahman. What reaches Brahman? We say leads to Brahman. It means the mind. The mind is led to Brahman through brahmacharya, which means we begin to see the one in everyone. That's the meaning. So this is called brahmacharya. And then aparigraha means non-greed, to learn to restrain the impulse of greediness. Then we have the niyamas. So the yamas counteract the kleshas. The niyamas come to establish sattva. They are all about increasing sattva. Basically, these are yogic conducts. They are called the observances. These are yogic conducts by which the mind is led more and more and more into sattva or purity. So this is what Swami Shivananda calls leading a divine life, leading a yogic life. A life which leads the mind more and more into the recognition of the true nature of the self or God in oneself and in the world. That's the meaning. So yamas, to counteract the operation of the kleshas, the operation of suffering, which generates the experience of suffering. Niyamas, in order to lead the mind, now that the mind is not so much moving in wrong directions, it should move in right directions. This is called niyamas. So, leading the mind to the recognition of God or the self, which means sattva, purity. That's really the meaning of purity. The meaning is that in Raja Yoga, purity is likened to a pure, clear lake. What happens in a clear, pure lake? You can see the bottom of the lake. That's what happens. The bottom of the lake is God or the self, the foundation of the lake. In the same way, in a pure mind, God or the self becomes self-evident. That's the meaning. Okay? Another analogy is if we have the space which seems to be limited inside the bottle. Why does it seem to be limited in the bottle? Because we are ignorant about the true nature of space. We don't know that space is limitless. We need to learn this, that space is indeed limitless. No object can limit space. And then we can learn to see the relationship between the bottle and space correctly, which means the bottle is not limiting space at all. It's just an illusion. So, in the same way, the experience that I am limited inside the mind and the body is an illusion, just in the same way, due to ignorance. But this illusion is strengthened by desires, attachments, right? So if the space starts thinking, oh, I am a bigger space, right? This bottle space, it sees a smaller space, smaller bottle. So, oh, I am a bigger bottle space, right? So now it becomes very much attached to its size, right? Or it says, I am an orange space, right? So all these forces are going to reinforce the wrong identity. You understand? That's the meaning. So these are clashes. Now we want to introduce conducts which are going to teach this space to recognize its all-pervading nature. That's the meaning. Which means purity. That's all it means. Purity simply means the mind is led to truth. That's the meaning, the true nature. So what are these niyamas? First one is saucha or shaucha. Shaucha means cleanliness and purity, right? So we all know that cleanliness is next to godliness, right? This is the meaning. So there has to be cleanliness on a gross level, physical level, and purity on a subtle level. So this cleanliness or purity is divided into two categories. Patanjali Maharishi explains. First is external, second is internal. The external is divided into three. the environment. Environment means primarily where you dwell. Where you are dwelling is your environment. So your home, specifically the place you do sadhana, your office, places where you dwell in, this is the first thing. It needs to be clean and pure. The second thing is your clothes, the clothing. Third is the body. These are the three that make external purity or cleanliness. Internal means the mind. The mind needs to be kept pure, sattvic. This we understand. So the external purity helps internal purity. What does it mean? We all know that when people want to make positive changes in their life, they clean their house. They get rid of things in the house. They make a new haircut. They go and buy new clothes. This is all because the mind is strongly identified with its environment, with the body and so on, and therefore we don't know how to directly purify the mind or shift it, so we do it through external things, which is good. We should use these props to effect a positive change in the mind. That's exactly what external purity means. So the idea is that the external guna, the external quality, will reflect in your mind. Only an extremely powerful mind can be independent of its environment. So great yogis can be independent of their environment, which means doesn't matter what goes on around them, they will be rooted in the reality. That's possible, but this is a very, very elevated state. Ordinarily, we should generate as much purity as possible in our environment that will uplift our mind. Because Rajasic and Tamasic energies in our environment are going to pull the mind down. That's guaranteed. So, if in the place we dwell in, if the place is not orderly, it's not clean, it will pull the mind down. If our clothes are not clean, they are not pure, which means they have a Rajasic or Tamasic energy in them, quality, it will pull the mind down. If the body is not kept clean, then it will pull the mind down. This is basically what it means. So this is external purity and internal purity. Also, purity means we should generate elevated energy. So we should do arati, we should have an altar, we should do things which bring the divine presence into our awareness. This is extremely important. Things which help us to, which help the mind to be in what we call remembrance. Remembrance means that you are in the presence of God. Why do we have an altar? The altar reminds you of God. God is everywhere all the time, right? It's only a matter of recognition, right? So let's say that we are doing arati. But can you do arati, right, for the sake of efficiency and speak on the phone at the same time? Right? Or can you maybe have a robot that will do arati for you? Right? So, you have a robot, you have a rotating hand, and it can do arati 24 hours a day. You can go and do your things, and you will get all the merit of the arati. Can it be? Why, when you do arati, you cannot speak on the phone? Or you cannot speak to someone? Isn't it arati? Is this arati or not? No. Why not? See, the fire is waved in front of the altar. Why is that not arati? What's missing? What's missing is your own awareness. You see, Artha is really your own awareness. The light with which you worship God is your own awareness. That's not the fire. See? If the fire is there and you are not aware of the fire, that's not Artha. Fire is there to focus your mind to remember that in front of you is God. That's all. Okay, so the altar is there for you to recognize God in the images on the altar. This is why it is. And actually what worships God, the worship of God, is your own recognition of God. Your own recognition is your own devotion, awareness, focus, that this is God. That's the worship. This can be done not only on the altar, it can be done everywhere. Every name and form, you can recognize God in it and therefore worship God in that form. The altar is an aid. It's a practice for us to learn to recognize divinity in names and forms. That's really what it is. That's called purity. Therefore, it's so important. Then we have Santosha. Santosha means, Swami Brahmananda says, Santosha is controlling the fault-finding nature. Mind has a very powerful fault-finding nature. In simple words, we call it complaining. The complaining nature of the mind is a force in the mind that agitates the mind, or a force that constantly looks to see what is wrong. So Santosha comes to remove this, to make the mind happy, cheerful, content. This is called Santosha. It's not that the yogi doesn't see things which are wrong. The yogi sees things which are wrong much better than us, because their mind is very pure. But they remove the fault-finding, complaining nature of them. This is a very powerful, agitating force, because it's a force driven by raga and dvesha, primarily dvesha. So this is called contentment. To establish cheerfulness, happiness, contentment. Doesn't matter what happens around us. Be contented, to be happy, to be cheerful. It's extremely important for yogis to keep the mind in a sattvic state. Then, tapas, Swami Brahmananda says this is simple living, high thinking. Simplifying our external life, having a rich inner life. Another way is reducing our wants, to simplify the life. And tapas means self-discipline. It means choosing the good over the pleasant, which means learning not to follow the raga and dvesha, the kleshas, desires, the attachments, etc., and to move towards a life which is focused on spiritual progress, rather than focused on comforts, to focus the mind on spiritual progress. Swami Brahmananda says we should give the body the basic comforts. He says we should have something that the body should feel basically comfortable. That's not a problem. To have good diet, a good place to sleep in, this is all good. But if the mind becomes dependent on those things, our spiritual progress is halted. Because again, we are reinforcing our identity with the body. That's all. And that's immediately a force of kleshas, a force of suffering. So again, it's just to increase the recognition of our true nature. Then, swadhyaya is an extremely important practice. Regular study of scriptures, contemplating on the teachings of the scriptures, and japa, repeating the mantra, and self-inquiry. All those things, see why? Because the scriptures teach us about the true nature of the self. They divert our mind towards reality, towards the Atma, towards God. Look at the difference when when you are exposed to this very poor quality knowledge like this gossip magazines and all those things. Your mind will immediately think the world is real. The world is real. The world is for enjoyment. So these things, this type of knowledge is a very powerful samsaric force. And when we study the scriptures, it's the other way around. It immediately uplifts the mind. It says the world is unreal. God is real. The self is real. So Svadhyaya is extremely important to give us the right vision of the goal of life, what we should do with our life, and how to attain God or the self, etc. Then we have Ishvara Pranidhana, which is self-surrender to God. Self-surrender to God is bhakti, devotion, again, recognition that everything in life comes from God. All the events in our life come from God. All the pleasures and the pains of life come from God. And therefore we surrender to them. We don't become resentful towards life. We trust life. This trusting life allows us to recognize that the hand of God is behind everything. All the experiences of our life come from God. Therefore, we can surrender to it. It doesn't mean that we don't act upon things. It doesn't mean that if we are sick, we don't take medicine. It just means that we are not troubled by what life brings to us, because everything comes from the will of God. This is called self-surrender. It makes the mind totally peaceful, totally resting in reality. It neutralizes the forces of the kleshas and allows us to abide in reality while we go through what we call prarabdha karma. So self-surrender is extremely important. It allows us to very powerfully recognize the divinity of everything, basically. That's the meaning. And to neutralize the forces of samsara. So these are the niyamas. Together with the yamas, they allow us to lead a yogic life, a divine life, a life in which our mind is constantly moving towards the self or God, systematically. Om, 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 Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om, peace, peace, peace. Om Bolo Sadguru Shivananda Maharaj Ki Jai. Vishnu Devananda Maharaj Ki Jai.